Kia ora everyone, and welcome to our latest webinar, Get Ready for the Future, How Climate is Shaping Business. My name is Natalie Ward and I'm the Sales Manager here at Toitū Envirocare. So I'm joined today by Dr. Belinda Mathers, who is Toitū's Chief Science and Advisory Officer. Belinda studied chemical and process engineering, which has been a great basis for a career in helping businesses understand and reduce their environmental impacts. Belinda has been with Toitū for over 12 years and currently oversees the technical robustness of our offerings, our JASANS accreditation, and our advisory offerings, among many other things. We're also joined by Paul Gardiner, Toitū's Chief Customer and Marketing Officer. Paul brings 25 years of senior executive experience from various multinational companies in the UK, Australia, and here in New Zealand, and he will provide a vital business perspective during our discussion this morning. We're also excited to be joined by Hilary West-Reeve, who is the Director and Sustainability Lead at Phoenix Recycling Group. And Hilary will provide insight a little bit later on into how Phoenix are using carbon reporting to support business growth and informed decision making. So the discussion today will include insights that are great to help start your business's climate action journey, but some of you might be taking action already or even working with us, but we recommend sharing the insights from our experts today with your stakeholders and supply chains to bring them in on the conversation. I'm just going to share my screen, and before we start the main session, I'll give you all a little bit of background into kind of who we are at Toitū. So we are a subsidiary of Manaaki Whenua Landcare Research. So that does mean that science is at the heart of everything we do. We have been around for over 20 years, which if you think about carbon or even environmental management, when it became mainstream, it definitely wasn't 20 odd years ago. So nice to know that we're at the start of it all. We ourselves are audited by JASANS, which means our certifications are globally recognised and adds the rigour required to hold up in a changing market. And finally, here at Toitū, we are all about impact, and we work with over 1,000 businesses, both New Zealand and internationally, to support them on their climate action journey. So Belinda, what's happening in the world of carbon?
Thanks, Natalie. Kia ora koutou. So to set the scene a bit today, I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change itself and how we're going in our reduction journey compared with what the atmosphere needs. So there's a limit to how much carbon we can release into the global atmosphere before we lock in a global temperature rise of 1.5 degrees or more. And we're using that budget really rapidly. I like to think of the atmosphere as a bathtub. We know how much can fit in before it starts to overflow. The tap is the emissions going into the atmosphere, and the two drains are the natural sinks, such as the ocean and sequestration in trees and soil, and engineered emissions removals like carbon capture and storage. At the moment, the tap's on full and the drains are too small. So we're seeing the atmosphere warming, which is causing our climate to change. Net zero is talked about a lot, and net zero at a global level is when the emissions going in and the removals coming out are balanced so that we're living within that budget and we can then start looking at restoring and improving. So this image comes from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC's 6th assessment report. The darker the colour that you see here, the more impact is expected from climate change. So you can see that New Zealand maybe isn't as impacted as the north of the planet, but we still will see some significant impacts. As the globe heats, New Zealand will become increasingly a land of weather extremes. The west and the south in particular will get wetter, leading to more floods, while high temperatures and reduced rainfall will bring more droughts and fires to the east and the north. And as an importing and exporting nation, we're going to be affected by climate change happening elsewhere. Things like supply chain interruptions. And the biggest contributors to our economy, agriculture and tourism, are also likely to be affected by changes in weather conditions and the impacts that those changes have. So there is global consensus that climate change is happening, that it's caused by human activities, and that it needs to be kept below 1.5 to 2 degrees by the end of the century to avoid really major global impacts. Keeping warming below 2 degrees and even limited to 1.5 is still possible, but it's going to take immediate and sustained emissions cuts by all of us. The latest IPCC report models a bunch of different scenarios. The green line you can see at the bottom of this slide shows the emissions reduction trajectory required to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. The other lines show how global policies, pledges, and actual action is contributing to the emissions reductions that we need to see. So as we stand, current global commitments aren't enough to reach net zero emissions by 2050. And the models are telling us that we're actually on a pathway to close to 3 degrees warming by the end of the century. The longer we wait to ambitiously reduce our emissions, the harder it's going to be to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So where does New Zealand fit into this global picture? We don't have the latest data yet. There's always a year or two's lag, but it looks like we might have peaked our national gross emissions. Based on the last couple of years' data that is available, looks like we're making some progress also towards decoupling emissions from our global domestic, our gross domestic product, our GDP, which is important if we're going to reduce our emissions without reducing our quality of life. Our challenge now is to reduce emissions fast enough to minimise long-term climate impacts. This is going to rely on a mix of clear and ambitious government policy and companies that are willing to make decisions that drive us towards the positive tipping points that will make further reductions happen even more quickly. Many of the countries we export to and the companies that buy our goods are strengthening their expectations. So the companies in Toitū's programs and working with us are in a great position to be leading us in the right direction. We hear a lot about negative tipping points, and I feel like I've been saying a whole lot of negative stuff, and hearing about how we're reaching points of no return when it comes to climate and other impacts like species extinction. What we hear less about is the positive tipping points that are driving us in the right direction. Some examples of positive tipping points are that with renewable energy now being cheaper to generate globally than fossil fuel-based energy, the world will naturally move in the direction of renewable energy, provided that the oil and gas sectors aren't propped up through subsidies. The uptake of EVs and other alternative fuel vehicles has been exponential globally, both in terms of the number of sales and the percentage of the market. 2022 figures show us that over 10 million EVs or other alternative fuel vehicles were sold in 2022, which is about 14% of all sales. Green investment is also growing quickly, with investment in transitioning to green power matching the amount spent on producing oil and gas for the first time in 2022. So these types of changes have allowed that decoupling that I mentioned before of GDP and emissions in some countries, showing that it is possible to grow an economy while reducing our emissions. Emissions since the start of the industrial age have already caused at least 1.2 degrees of warming, with more locked in through the buildings and other assets that we've already got in place. The MFE released a national adaptation plan a couple of years ago, which outlines the risk to New Zealanders and New Zealand businesses from climate change. Some of those risks include more severe weather events leading to reduced productivity, supply chain risks caused by weather events, things like freight disruptions, and the availability of raw materials, especially for primary sector products. There's also likely to be tourism impacts. Another risk is the stranded asset risk, where funding or insurance is no longer available for assets that are at a high risk of climate impact. So trying to bring all this together, I've developed this diagram to just try and explain or summarise how climate change impacts our lives. I've seen diagrams like this called horrendograms, but I've been calling it my spaghetti and meatballs diagram. Greenhouse gas emissions cause the impacts, or directly cause those impacts in black there, things like more droughts and floods, wildfires and sea level rise. Those things cause further impacts to our health, our economy, our society, our ecosystems. Severe storms can affect supply chains, but so can droughts. Droughts in the Panama Canal area over the last year or so have reduced the number of ships that can pass through the canal really significantly. Temperature increases affect our need for air conditioning and other energy use to maintain our quality of life. Changes in climate affect what will grow where, which affects our livelihoods, our ecosystems, and human health. And that's just the start. So overall, it's pretty complicated, but the impacts are extensive and could be really extreme. So moving to where the rubber hits the road, I guess, what can businesses do to understand and minimise their impacts? I just have a couple of slides to describe how to understand your emissions, and then I'll hand over to Paul to talk about some of the market drivers. It can help to think about carbon accounting in a similar way to financial accounting. Where are you drawing your boundary around what's going in your books, the activities that you're carrying out, and what you're tracking, and what will be tracked and counted in somebody else's inventory or their accounting. It's a matter of tracking the activities, understanding what you've done, translating that into greenhouse gas emissions. Greenhouse gas accounting uses a set of scopes or categories to help with this. The first category is direct emissions, activities under your direct control that can create emissions. So things like boilers or diesel used in your vehicles, refrigerants that might be leaking refrigerants to the atmosphere, those sorts of things. These are your scope 1 or category 1 direct emissions. Following from those direct emissions, we've got indirect emissions, so activities that you have less influence or control over, where the emissions are actually happening on somebody else's assets, not yours. So indirect emissions from energy you purchase, like electricity, these are the scope 2 or category 2 emissions. You've got control over how much electricity you purchase, or electricity energy efficiency improvements, but not necessarily where or how that energy was generated. So it's kind of moving down to be a bit more indirect, and requires influence and engagement to make some of the changes. The rest of the indirect emissions are even further down beneath the surface, things like business travel or freight. The indirect emissions furthest out from your operations, your upstream emissions from your suppliers, downstream emissions from your customers, are often lumped together as value chain emissions. You've got some level of responsibility for the choices you make, say in travelling or purchasing goods and services, but they're directly controlled by somebody else in the value chain. Ideally, the whole value chain's working together and collaborating and engaging to reduce direct emissions, and then that reduces the entire value chain's footprint. Typically, we see that the scope 1, the direct emissions, are about 10% of an organisation's footprint, and those indirect emissions are more like 90%. So we group emissions to be able to better analyse them and plan action, but it's really important to remember that both the top of the iceberg and everything below the surface fall under your wider responsibility. So it's important to be looking at the full spectrum of opportunities and risks as you work to reduce your emissions and engage with your value chain. So thinking about the emission inventories in a wee bit more detail, and this is my final slide, but the traditional approach to calculating emissions has been largely focused on those core operational emissions where we can more easily get the data and have the direct control to make changes. But we're seeing the net widening to increase focus on indirect emissions, those that occur in the operations of others, from sources that aren't fully owned or controlled by the company. So an example here might be emissions associated from flying. The actual emissions occur from the plane owned and operated by the airline, but a proportion of those emissions are allocated to you if you have a seat on the plane. So the emissions from other businesses affect your footprint. But the other key thing to note is that your direct emissions will be included as indirect emissions in your customer's inventory. So one company's direct emissions will, be another company's indirect emissions. So this means that your customers will be more and more interested in your emissions and what you're doing about them. So on that note, I'm going to hand over now to Paul to talk a bit about the market dynamics and where that's going and how that impacts businesses. So handing over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Belinda. Morena, everyone. I'd like to change direction slightly and talk about those things that are driving change within business. And there's certainly a lot happening, which I'm sure isn't a surprise given the urgency around climate change and meeting those global targets that are in place. Just a note, if you're a Toitū member, there is a chance that you may be over what's happening in the market and some of the content in this segment, but I think it's really good to recap as things are moving so quickly. Also, we're really happy for you to share this information with your internal stakeholders and your supply chain so you can get your suppliers thinking about how they can help you. If you aren't a Toitū member, feel free to use any of the content from this presentation to help you build a business case to get your organisation onto that carbon journey. I guess firstly, for those non-Toitū members again, I wanted to address the potential elephant in the room around government. Our sales team occasionally, and probably more recently than not, get feedback from businesses saying, why should we be doing anything in the carbon space if the government is walking away from climate change? And that is certainly not the case. And while the approach of the new administration has shifted, they are certainly steadfast around their commitment to being net zero by 2050. So we have the Zero Carbon Act, we have the ETS, we have international commitments such as the Paris Agreement in place. However, don't expect the government to come along and tap you on the shoulder and ask you to get on with it. Rather, you could expect your client or your parent company to be giving you a nudge. Also, those external factors such as legislation, market demand, investor pressure, and of course, customer expectations. Those are the things that we are seeing driving rapid change within business. So let's hone in on customer expectations. So we all know the customer is the heart of any business. So the question is, what do they expect from you around your carbon strategy? We've created a bit of a Toitū's top tips here around how to manage your customers, which I'll quickly take you through. Number one, it starts with transparency and honesty. So surprise, surprise, consumers are increasingly skeptical of marketing claims. They are actively looking now to distinguish between those genuine efforts that a business makes and superficial marketing, which is probably no surprise why the Commerce Commission is getting more complaints in this space. They want you to be really ambitious around your reduction goals. They don't want you to be token. They're looking for genuine commitment to sustainability because that's what aligns with their personal values. You need to also share what you're doing to get there. So that could be things like renewable energy, implementing new technology, reducing waste in operations, for example. Simply offsetting carbon emissions just doesn't cut it, and it's not in line with best practice. Great example, we recently worked with a client around moving 100% of their carbon budget that they were spending on just purchasing carbon credits to investing that budget into an actual reduction strategy. That was a much better approach from them, and it was received really well by their customers. Address your value chain. So surprisingly, consumers are more knowledgeable around Scope 3 emissions. They actually want businesses to take responsibility for the full life cycle of their products. So for example, from cradle to grave. And lastly, it's really important to be consistent, but also don't feel the pressure to be perfect. Revising climate reduction targets is okay. It's a natural part of the business sustainability journey, as long as those changes are communicated transparently and they're genuine. I think Air New Zealand did a really good job communicating their change in strategy due to things that were happening beyond their control, moving their targets out, but also still committing to that 2050 target. So Ultimately, all of these things we think will help you maintain the integrity of your brand as a whole, not just around climate action. Regulation and compliance. So I can feel like a collective sigh coming through the screen, but it's actually not that boring. There's some massive developments happening in this area over a short period of time, which we think will be real game changers in the carbon space around influencing the full value chain, both internationally and locally. Worth noting, some of these things I'm going to talk to you about here may not directly affect your business now, but we think it's good for you to get a sense of what's on the horizon and what could impact your business in the future around climate regulation and compliance. So firstly, we're seeing measures from the EU and the US, which will impact exporters who are not only going to have to report their emissions, but also meet those intensity regulations. Great example is the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM for short. If you're new to the carbon market, what you'll find is that we love acronyms, and you'll hear a few acronyms in this particular segment. Introduced by the European Union, primarily impacts industries and companies involved with the importation of those carbon-intensive products in the EU. So at the moment, it's just concentrating on those major sectors such as cement, electricity, fertilizer, and steel. The whole idea around CBAM is designed to prevent that carbon leakage. So carbon leakage occurs when a company moves production to another country with laxer climate policies to avoid those carbon costs that they would perhaps incur in the EU, for example. So this has a real impact on emerging countries, also powerhouses such as China and Russia that produce a whole lot of high intensity products like steel, for example. This isn't a bad thing. It encourages these suppliers to obviously clean up their acts in countries that don't have a strong carbon regulation. In New Zealand, we may not be directly impacted by CBAM in the same way that other countries are, but there are implications for agricultural, our agricultural and forestry sectors. But I think it's easy to assume that this framework, once it's in place, the scope will be widened to other sectors. So a little bit of a window into the future for our exporters who are not entirely off the hook yet. Closer to home, we've seen the introduction of climate-related disclosures, or CRD. This is a real game changer, in our opinion. It essentially encourages companies to really rethink their entire business model around how they would operate in a low-carbon economy. So it's mandatory reporting framework that's in place where businesses are using this to communicate their exposure around climate-related risks and opportunities. So while it's here in New Zealand, it is an international initiative. It also impacts 80% of our trading partners who are also under this regime. Here in New Zealand, it directly impacts financial institutions, NZX listed businesses, or businesses with a market cap of 60 mil or assets over 1 billion. We estimate that to be just over 200 companies in New Zealand. We call these companies climate-related entities. Once again, we expect the scope to widen as businesses are required to report. For example, in Australia, we expect 20,000 businesses there to be fully phased by 2027. So they've definitely gone a lot deeper than New Zealand. Now, while the regime is a reporting framework only, CREs are not actually required to reduce, right? But many of them do, and a lot of them are with Toitū. But they are still required to report their full value chain under targets and metrics. So this does have a potential impact for you if you are a supplier here in New Zealand, or to Australian clients, or to 80% of our trading partners outside of New Zealand. Also worth noting that we are seeing a trickle-down effect working with businesses here in New Zealand that are now having to report their New Zealand data to their head office offshore under the climate-related disclosures regime in that particular country. But really, the biggest impact locally will be for suppliers of climate-related entities. So what does that look like if you're a supplier, if you're a small business working for one of those 200 plus companies? As I mentioned, companies under the CRD regime are required to measure their full value chain, so that's scope 1, 2, and 3. So for example, if you are a supplier of materials, logistics, services, you may be asked to provide your emissions data that aligns with their reporting requirements. So that could be electricity, could be emissions for that particular product or service that you offer, or it could be even your reduction plan that they could ask for. As I said, CRD is not about reduction, but it actually kind of is. The byproduct of CRD is that it encourages engagement with your entire value chain. So as Belinda mentioned before, your emissions are someone else's emissions. So it impacts how suppliers operate. It impacts the relationships they have with their clients. So as a supplier, it's really important to be over this, to be proactive and to be ready if asked. And really, it'll allow you to be more competitive in the market, which is what we call the carbon advantage. The good news is that if you are already on a Toitū program, you will have that emissions data to hand. So I've spoken about supply chain engagement. What does it actually mean? What does the end game look like in terms of impact? This is a great example. Walmart started their supplier engagement process in 2017. After setting their science-based targets, they engaged with over 5,000 suppliers. 6 years later, they achieved 1 gigaton of emissions reduction without having to offset. They actually were 6 years ahead of target and are continuing to keep pushing. So that is the potential impacts when you have something like the CRD regime, which is targeting businesses to influence from the top down. So you've done the mahi around measuring, you've got your reduction plan in place, and of course you want to communicate your success to your customers and your stakeholders. But the thing is, making a carbon claim can be challenging for businesses. And that's due to a combination of factors. It's around measurement complexities, evolving standards, and as we've spoken about, the mistrust around consumers. And so as such, this does create a lot of media attention for the wrong reasons. So here's some things to potentially think about when you make that claim. Firstly, make sure the data that you're reviewing is accurate. So you can't manage what you don't measure. Measurement starts with your base year and then period on period reporting to make sure that you're moving in the right direction. Old data isn't accurate. Old data or inaccurate data is just not good enough. Avoid those sweeping generic claims. So for example, we are carbon friendly. What does that even mean? As opposed to our product is made using 100% renewable energy. So that is a specific claim. And link your claim to evidence. So if you're using your text or graphics, whatever that communication is that you are using in the marketplace, make sure that it's backed by clear certification and verified credentials. So that's effectively third party. That's a third party that's checked that data. And also be explicit around those credentials. So don't use shorthand claims. So e.g., we're carbon zero certified. Provide the full name and explanation of the certification scope and meaning. So where do we go to from here? Well, I guess hopefully this segment's provided you with a bit of insight around what a transformed carbon market looks like now for businesses, and a market that all businesses are going to have to operate in. So how do you get started if you're not on that journey? I guess the first thing is it's around figuring out what your why is. Not so long ago, your why was around climate change being the main driver, businesses wanting to be part of the movement. Fast forward perhaps a couple of years, and it's around compliance and reporting. It's around meeting expectations of your customers. It's around having access to markets. It's around providing investors with the right information. So figuring out your why is the first step, which will really determine, I guess, what your carbon strategy is, because effectively all roads lead to Rome, which is a more sustainable business. And then that will help you decide where you jump in with us on the carbon journey. So we can either help you assess your climate impacts, we can work with you on a transition plan, we can help with your annual inventory, we can get you ready for verification, or we can certify you on one of our programs. But ultimately, with our programs, it's about giving you the confidence to know that if you're in the market and you're making a claim, we will back that claim, which is super important. And so the next steps for you to think about. So start having conversations with your supply chain. Talk to them about the kind of information that they will need of you, and then figure out how you're going to supply that data data to them. If you are yet to begin your climate journey, utilize the content from this from this presentation to develop a business case. We can help you with that. A carbon management plan is not a nice to have. It is now directly linked to ROI. And then also come and have a chat with us. It's definitely not a one size fits all approach anymore. We can help you figure out what your why is and get you started on the journey.
Cool. Thanks, Belinda and Paul. So we're now going to hear from Hilary, and I will just stop sharing my screen. Here we go. So Hilary, oh goodness, my voice has gone today. Hilary West-Reeve is a director and sustainability governance lead at Phoenix Recycling Group. So after a successful career as a commercial architect for 30 years, Hilary's career evolved to focus on the circular economy of recycled materials as renewable resources for sustainable manufacturing and decarbonisation. She's a member of various industry groups and was previously the chair of the Sustainable Steel Council. Phoenix have been net carbon zero certified, Toitū net carbon zero certified for 3 years, and are focused on contributing to a circular economy. So Hilary, over to you.
Morena, everyone. Thank you for having me, Toitū. I'm here to, I guess, give a little bit of a business perspective on what it's like to be a voluntary carbon reporter. I guess in industries where you least expect to find it, and I think that's the challenge we face. We're a business that works across manufacturing, energy, auto, and construction. So large scale, complex supply chains all around New Zealand and globally. And so what does it mean for someone like us to actually look at reducing carbon, or even just knowing where to start? And I think by voluntarily starting 3 years ago, we've certainly been on a journey just to figure out where our baseline is. For those who don't understand what Phoenix does, we're recycling predominantly metals, but we also do batteries and e-waste. About 100 million kilos of material we are diverting from landfills and actually circulating them overseas predominantly, some locally. We've got 240 staff. We have over 300,000 separate loads we're weighing over weigh bridges all year round. And we know every granule that's coming through our gates at any one time. When we look at what we started with at the beginning, we had power in some places. We didn't have data in some places. We've got about 25% of our car fleet is electric, low-hanging fruit for us. We've got in-yard equipment, hundreds of in-yard equipment. Some of that is electrified and plugged in where we can. But we have about 70 trucks on the road, large scale, right through to a skip truck. So you look at our business and go, why would you start voluntarily carbon reporting? But I think what Phoenix did a couple of years ago is if we can't convince the manufacturing sector, construction sectors, auto, energy to start the journey as well, then we've got to move those hard to abate industries as well. So we've gone, well, we'll put our flag up. We'll go, this is what we're going to try, and we're going to look at some incremental steps and see where we get to with Toitū, of course. If you don't know, you don't know where to start. And because we've been a data-led business from the beginning, because we weigh every element of every material we're recycling, we thought this is a perfect position for us to start. And why don't we know every element of our data for the carbon reporting of that circular economy journey? There is a lot of myth out there about the circular economy. Is it real? Is it tangible? And I think Phoenix has found we're fair and square in the middle of the circular economy with what we do. So it was a very good baseline for us to start contributing to that data set around what's context in New Zealand. But we've also put our hands up because we're a growing business as well. And I think you've got to start with, well, when's the right time to start declaring and being transparent about your carbon journey, about your sustainability journey? When I joined the business 4 years ago, we were 6 sites north of the Waikato. We were only doing 27 containers a year. We were quite a small business in comparison. Look at us 3 or 4 years later, we're 5 times the size. We've got 19 sites around the country, hundreds of thousands of square meters of footprint. We're doing close to 3,000 containers now per annum and a lot of bulk ships. So we've got a very large export market. So that we're being penalised almost as a business, as an exporter, because we're at the bottom of the world and we need to get all our resources like copper, aluminium, steel, back up into the global economy. We've got those electric arc furnaces. But we've had to start with where our scope starts, and that's on invoice. So it's very much like the financial reporting system. Whatever you're paying on invoice, you've got to put that in your scope. So for us, that's global end recycler. It could be as far as South Korea, it could be as far as Belgium, but we've had to include those emissions. So this is what it feels like for us on the map. 66% of our emissions sit in exporting. So we now know where our emissions sit, but I can't abate any of those because I don't own the ships. We can't manage when they're going to start transitioning into biofuel. Some of those lines down the bottom are, but being an Oceania, Pacific part of the world, we're not going to capture any of those ships anytime soon. So we've really had to look at what that means for our supply chain. So New Zealand, for us, when we were back in COVID, we started to look at the business footprint. We were just in the North Island. We thought we need to own and manage our own supply chain so we can own and manage our data. We can actually engage directly with our supply chain to stop double handling. We were only shipping out of 2 ports. Now we're doing out of 8. So what we've had to do is capture the road transportation emissions we're seeing within New Zealand. We're running a lot back and forth to a couple of very centralised hubs, Christchurch, Wellington, Auckland. Now we're moving everything out as quickly as we can east to those ports to actually reduce our on-road emissions in New Zealand. So we're actually winning and losing a lot of what we're going to reduce out of operational efficiencies of what we're moving on our roads in New Zealand, or the less that we're moving on our roads in New Zealand. So we've had to start looking at what that means for us for our own supply chain. We're also a third-party reporter for a lot of our customers. We have about 11,000 transactions a month. A lot of those businesses are wanting to record what they're diverting to land from landfill, but they're also needing us as a third-party logistics provider to provide those carbon emissions to actually move those recyclables around. We've actually put our hand up because we realise that New Zealand hasn't yet committed whether they're going to go hydrogen, electric, large-scale infrastructure. We move big trucks around like this one here on the screen. That battery now that you see is already obsolete in a year in operation. That's a challenge for us when you look at how fast technology is moving. When do you commit to transacting your entire fleet to electric or hydrogen if you don't yet have the right technology in place in New Zealand to do it? I think we found as a business, do we just sit and wait and sit on the fence knowing that there isn't any strategies here for us in this logistics space? Or do we put our hands up to trial things? So that sustainability challenge for us was, where can we help that makes sense for our business, that will help others, that will actually contribute to a collaboration, a partnership together? So this is with ICA. We've got trucks on the road with equivalent weights and tiers and moving similar products. So we do a lot of piloting, a lot of benchmarking with things we've already got in play, but a diesel alternative. And we trial them in small areas to go, what are the differences? What are the sustainability positives and negatives? What are the operational inefficiencies? Rather than go carte blanche, we're just going to change the entire thing across the country. We can do things in Auckland that we can't do in Invercargill. That is the challenge as a nationwide business, that you can't do it the same way everywhere. So we do a lot of trialing and we use data all the way through, so sustainability data everywhere we can, to actually form business cases for us, what might look like for us as a strategy going forward. These are all little nuggets that we're using on the way through. Huge part of us understanding our supply chain from a Scope 3 emissions point of view is actually starting to define what it looks like for certain products we're recycling. If I take batteries as an example, that has been a very complex supply chain to go end to end across the country with. We launched that a year ago. And what we've done is had to try and map what it feels like from a carbon emissions point of view, but also actually linking up all those components of the supply chain. We want New Zealand to electrify. In doing that, batteries are everywhere. And everything we do commercially, industrially, at home, if we're installing solar, power storage, Phoenix is the recycler of those batteries in New Zealand, but we've got to do it responsibly. And so we've actually had to set up a global supply chain with very specific EPA permits, but by carbon reporting every facet of that, we're transparently on contract with our customers, declaring the value by actually putting these batteries back in circulation, recovering those resources like copper, lithium, cobalt, rather than mining newer alternatives. So to get back into those new battery technologies rather than going to landfill. We know we've got issues with lithium in New Zealand. We know they're slipping into waste, and we know that they capture fire and they damage assets. So what we're saying is the Toitū journey for us around carbon reporting is actually creating strategies for us around how to manage really complex waste streams that we can actually help electrify New Zealand on that decarbonisation route. And we've had to verify that circular economy, and we've had to verify it from the bottom of the world in New Zealand, that it still matters to do it and not put it in landfill down here, that there is a value chain and there is a carbon journey, but we think it's still worth it with the data that we're seeing. And the other strategies we're forming as well, we're working with Ecotricity, they're our electric provider. We're renewable energy serviced, but then if we're going to start expanding, growing, what are we going to do to put our next footprint in? So we said, well, we need to create a hub in Auckland. That's where the population is. Our lowest carbon footprint is where we are, where our population is. So we're setting up a solar-powered factory in Auckland, actually coming online in December. So we're making decisions everywhere across the business because we know our carbon data, because we know our recycling data. And when we get to something like the energy sector, it's really hard to suddenly switch to being electric. We've got sites that have taken 2 years to get new transformers online so that we can plug more stuff in, more of our equipment in. There's a real time lag depending on where you are around the country. But what we're doing across that whole energy sector space, where it's decom, it's recycling copper, it's cable, it's EV large storage batteries, it's solar panel recycling, but it's getting into the nuts and bolts of even used transformer oil recycling, porcelain recycling, glass recycling. We're actually having to look at the 1%, 1%, 1% we can incrementally add to the value of our customers. Transpower, Contact Energy. We do a lot of work in the large power sector to create a zero waste platform for the circular economy of New Zealand. And so I think Phoenix has been fair and square in there. And I think having that Toitū journey in the background, complementing what we're doing in the circular economy space, has given us a really great baseline platform strategy to help others, but actually make us smarter and more efficient as well. So anyway, that's all I've got to say today. Thank you very much.
Amazing. Thank you, Hilary. I love that comment. If you don't know, you don't know where to start. It just feels like a direct message for those just beginning on their journey. You know, it's okay to just start measuring and start understanding, you know, what's going on with your own footprint. Also, those practical examples around changing the freight. That's something we hear a lot in my neck of the woods in Toitū around what can I actually do about things that I can't necessarily control. So I think that's really, really vital information for everyone on the webinar today. So now we're going to move into the Q&A section of the event. So please use the Q&A function down the bottom of your screen. We have had a couple come through, so that's great. Keep popping them in and upvoting as well. So I've just got one for you here, Belinda. Do you have any real life examples of customers' expectations in the carbon space within value chain and holding businesses to account?
Yeah, I think at the moment we're seeing that it's the large international companies that are doing most of that. I'm sure it's happening at a local level as well, but companies like Unilever and Danone, Nestle are really demanding that their customers, including companies like Fonterra and other New Zealand companies, understand their impacts and are doing something about it because that impacts on their value chain footprint.
Yeah.
Sorry, can I just expand on that? So, I mean, I think it's fair to say that nearly all customers expect this now. So in most surveys around the world, you'll see at least 3/4 of consumers are wanting businesses to do better. So, but the problem is how do businesses respond to that, which has been the issue. So, you know, on the back of what Belinda said, companies like Volkswagen, you go back to 2015, where there was Dieselgate, which kind of blew up in their face. So this is something that all companies are going to have to respond to, but it's just your execution that can get you in trouble.
Yeah, perfect. And Paul, just flipping this one back at you as well. Do you have any direct data that links back to ROI?
Yeah, look, I think that the data for ROI will determine on what your business is and how you operate in the marketplace. But your ROI measures could be access to markets or not having access to markets. It could be winning tenders. It could be just being a more efficient business through operating, through implementing new measures, or it could be just increasing staff engagement. So it depends really what business you have and how you operate in the market.
Yeah,
I mean,
perfect.
I could add to that, but I suppose as a business from an ROI perspective, I mean, absolutely, we're seeing that if you're carbon literate, if you understand what your customers are needing at a reporting level, and you're able to deliver a services model that helps them capture it and make it easy, absolutely. I think there is a very much a new language to learn, and I think we've found over those carbon reporting years, getting up to speed on that and being current on what's going on in the market, on trends, and being able to deliver that as a business as well is crucial. And you actually almost got to be ahead of it. You've got to know what the customers need before they even know what they need to help them do it. And that's the challenge, is always being enough ahead to actually have those answers. So.
A bit of a mind reader there, Hilary. Yeah. Cool. And just another question from the chat, and this is actually quite a common one, so I might flick this one through to you, Paul, and then maybe Belinda, you can tackle it from a science perspective as well. So from Toitū's actual data, is it realistic to assume that absolute decoupling is possible? So decoupling your emissions from economic growth in line with that 1.5? And then a second part to that is about the GDP and economic growth. What are the increases in well-being?
Okay. Probably one for Belinda, but from what I'm seeing is it can be done, and it is being done. So it's being done here in New Zealand, and it's also happening overseas. But Belinda can probably add more value to that question.
Yeah, sure. And I think it's a really good question, because absolute, complete decoupling is a real stretch. I don't know that complete decoupling of GDP and emissions is possible right now. I think partial decoupling is. And I don't know whether complete decoupling is, from my personal view, is entirely desirable either, because we want to be thinking about, the limits of environmental, capability and capacity and those sorts of things. So I think that even if we could completely decouple from a carbon perspective, there's a lot more to think about around other environmental limits. So that's where, do we want unlimited growth for the sake of growth? Probably not, because, if you're only thinking about one element of growth, you're not thinking about the whole picture. So yeah, my view is that yes, we want to continue to grow to an extent. Yes, we want to decouple emissions from our economy as much as possible, but I think there are limits. And Hilary, I don't know whether you've got any perspectives on that.
Look, I think the more we have reporting, the more data that's coming through, the more it improves. I think if I look at the circular economy data, the hundreds of products we're recycling, right now it feels frontierish, a lot of what we're doing. And I think there is a lot of alignment. You think of how long it's taken financial models to align in an auditing system. I mean, we're expecting just to be able to flip a switch and have the sustainability view suddenly be miraculously perfect from the start. And I think when you look at upstream and downstream and what we're trying to capture, and a lot of it's not within your control. So it's going to take time. Yeah.
Cool. And Paul, just on the back of the kind of comments regarding Air New Zealand that you mentioned in the presentation as well. So what are your thoughts on the rollback of Air New Zealand's climate ambitions? How are customers and other businesses responding? Yeah,
well, I think they were, first and foremost, they were honest and transparent around what was happening. And the reality is that the drivers that forced them to change their approach were outside their control. So I go back to that: be ambitious, but actually be realistic at the same time. And if things change, you need to adapt. I mean, the fact is they were expecting to get new planes, and they haven't got those planes. They were expecting to operate using a different type of diesel. They haven't got that diesel. So those are things that are outside of their control. So yeah, moving their short-term target out, but also maintaining that 2050 commitment, I think is fair and reasonable.
Yeah, cool. Belinda, I'm going to fire this one your way. If my direct emissions are my customers' indirect emissions, aren't the emissions double counted? How do we avoid double counting inventories?
Yep, and that's a good question, and one that comes up often, and that's why we have that sort of scope 1, scope 2, scope 3 approach. If you added together every company and individual scope 1 emissions, that would be the emissions of the world, more broadly. But because there's different influences that different companies have over emissions, it's actually really useful to have that double counting as long as you understand how it's working and how it fits together. Because, you know, as a business, we can decide whether to travel or not, right? So we can decide whether to get on that plane, but it's the airlines that can just work out how to be more emissions efficient in their operations. So if we didn't have that double counting, if we weren't looking at full value chain, we're not really providing the drivers for our suppliers and our customers to be reducing their emissions.
Yep, awesome. So Hilary, this one here is not a question, but a comment for thanking you for such an interesting and inspiring overview, leading the way. But I do have, it's just popped off my screen now, here we go. I do have a question that we're going to fire through to you anyway. Have you seen any unintended consequences to carbon accounting, and what can be done to mitigate those?
Yes, I think the challenge for us is a lot of the scope 3 reporting around supply chain and say in the logistics space is the tools available at the moment are very much asset management tools. I've got a fleet of trucks, they're doing X, Y, Z, but they're not capturing the emissions profile of that route. You can't sort of download a report on a per annum basis. If you sell those assets in a period of time, they disappear into a vortex of nowhere. And so we're working with a number, obviously, of those fleet tools around what it feels like to report. And you might have a milk run. So how do I allocate emissions for a load on a multi-journey and then across a number of customers? You want to do the milk run because you don't want to do a number of single trips all the time, but how do you quantify that for an individual customer if you've got multiple customers on that trip? And I think this is where it gets hard, using GPS data from Google combined with a number of other of your tools, combining with a bit of your CRM and other things. So you're actually pulling data for a number of places, and then you're trying to wrap it into almost a Power BI bow that you can place in your customers to access. And that is the challenge, is actually getting all that data aligning accurately or as best you can. Is it a GHG protocol calculation? Is it some other tool that you might be reporting to? Everyone is doing it slightly differently and reporting in a slightly different system. So what you want to do is standardize, I guess, as a third-party provider, but it ends up being bespoke because every business is different. Every business has got a different services model, or they're a different scale and size. So yeah, it is challenging.
Awesome, thanks for that, Hilary. So another one here, we mentioned that consumers are expecting businesses to do better when it comes to reducing their carbon footprint. Are there any particular consumers or demographics that are the most demanding? Paul, what are you seeing in the market?
Yeah, most probably the young consumers coming through that, and I just go back to what I said before, sustainability is really aligned with their personal values. So I think that's something to be really cognizant of as a marketer if you're selling to young people.
Yeah, perfect. I'd have to agree with you there as well. Belinda, one for you here. Oh, it's just jumped off my screen. Here we go. Heard you're exporting metal. So New Zealand has local steel and aluminium industries. Is exporting done because it's more cost or carbon effective?
The question asker said actually that one was for Hilary, so I'll pass on to Hilary.
Oh, sorry.
Should be.
No, that's right. It's a late correction.
So we have an oversupply of material in New Zealand. So even when that EAF switches on, New Zealand has more than double the volume of steel being recycled on land at the moment. So we can't just keep piling it up here. It will be going offshore as a global commodity. We've got multiple territories across Asia that have electric arc furnaces who need the recycled steel. And we will continue to export to those. But that goes the same for copper, aluminium, all those. We buy about 50 different types of grades of metals coming in, whether it could be brass or steel, for example, stainless steel. But within those grades are 10 to 15 to 20 different subgrades of that material. So we make over 100 products that are melt ready. So it's a very complex I hated chemistry when I was going through school, but it feels like the periodic table for us. We are in the super alloy space of creating those specific melt ready. So there's always a market for those. Some of them are local, but we will always be global. We're just making too much. I guess the consumer model of making and building and that general wear and tear infrastructure still brings a constant volume through that we have to move.
Perfect. And I might sneak one more in there. There's just a couple come through in the normal chat. So Hilary, this one's for you as well to finish. Okay. What challenges did you have with electrifying your car fleet, and how did you overcome them?
That was the easiest part, actually. Because our hardest part is actually switching the trucks and the sites over. We've got a lot of cases across New Zealand where we don't have enough power. And to get the transformer in, get the consenting in place, obviously working with multi-parties. You pay for the asset, but you don't own the asset. Do you place it on your site or outside on your boundary? Do you have control over that line charge, that you can grow on that line charge? Those are the challenging parts for us, is actually getting the power in the right places. And it does take time. So that sustainability journey has often been around which sites do we need to upgrade first, where is the most of that volume. And I think we've been using the Toitū carbon accounting data for ourselves to actually benchmark to say, well, this is what the circular economy of recycling batteries looks like now as a carbon footprint. But if I don't know it now, how am I going to know if we're improving that carbon footprint over time? So it's to record progress, not only as a business model, but product by product. And I think Phoenix's goal certainly is to hopefully help contributing to the emissions factors in a New Zealand context around LCA, scope C and E and D, because we are cradle to cradle with what we do with our materials. And I think if we can create good data that New Zealand can use, that's here in New Zealand, that actually reflects the supply chain of what those metals, batteries, e-waste looks like, we will have added value to the sustainability data reporting. And I think that's what we want to actually say, there is value not going to landfill. And this is what it looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. Brilliant. Thanks, Hilary. Well, that's all we have time for. So thank you all for joining us this morning. Thank you, Belinda, Paul and Hilary, for your time this morning. And I hope you all have a great rest of your Thursday. Ka kite.